Is it still live?
Yeah, it's good. It's just...
Okay. Can I just do like a review?
Sure.
Okay. In our discussions on Mukhtasar and Quduri, we've been looking at in the discussions of the Mukhtasar and Quduri, we've been looking at the chapter of purification in Hanafi law, and we've covered the Wudu, the ablution, its integrals and its sunnahs, and the Ghusl, right, its integrals, its sunnahs, and what causes it. And both of the two that we've already covered are mentioned in chapter 5, verse 6 of the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, which is called the verse of purification. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق وامسحوا برؤوسكم وأرجلكم إلى الكعبين. So the first part of that verse talks about wudu. So, O you who believe, when you intend to pray the prayer, right, and it's understood that you are in the state that you are already not having wudu. You're in a state, because the person who already has wudu, right, it's not an obligation, but the verse then would be understood to be a recommendation, because wudu on top of wudu, right, is light on top of light. Right, so if you intend to pray the prayer, then wash your face, wash your faces, and wash your arms up until and including the elbows. Wipe your heads and wash your feet until the ankles. Then the verse continues, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ جُنُبًا فَاتَّهَّرُوا. And if you are in a state of major ritual impurity, if you're in a state of janabah, right, then fully purify yourself. And we discussed that the ghusl is an emphatic form of purification. It's an extra, a stronger form of purification. وَإِن كُنْتُمْ جُنُبًا فَاتَّهَّرُوا. Right? And then Allah talks about, He says, subhanahu wa ta'ala, that if you are traveling or sick, right, and you relieve yourself, and you don't have water, right, just paraphrasing the verse, and you don't find any water, right, then فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَيْدِيكُمْ مِنْهُ. Then make tayammum of pure soil. Right, we'll talk about what tayammum means, of pure soil, right, and wipe your face and your arms with it. Right, after that, Allah says that He does not intend to put any undue hardship on you. Right? Rather, He intends to purify you and complete the blessing upon you. A really beautiful verse. Right? And there's a lot of rulings. Right? Almost all of the rulings of purification come from this verse. Right? So today we'll be talking about a few subtopics and then talking about the alternative to the wudu and the ghusl, right, which is tayammum. Right? And the word tayammum itself means intention, right? Something to intend something. Right? So just before we go into the tayammum, there are some sub-issues of purification that the author brings. First of them being tanning. Right? Tanning, right? The treatment of, right, the hide of an animal. Right? So now, death itself, right? Before that, right, the body of an animal, or likewise any living thing, right, has blood within it. Right? And blood, right, flowing blood is impure. We've already took that in wudu, because when blood comes out, it's a condition that it's flowing, because flowing blood is impure. Right? If it doesn't flow, then it doesn't break the wudu, nor is it impure. Right? So the flowing blood in the body, right, if the animal is not slaughtered, that blood stays in the body. Right? If they're not slaughtered in the proper way, the blood remains in the body. Therefore, the hide, the skin of that animal contains that flowing blood. Therefore, it is impure. Right? But if an animal is slaughtered properly, right, the slaughtering allows all of the flowing blood to come out. The blood that remains in the flesh or in the body. So if you buy like a steak or something, right, you'll see there's some red liquid there. Right? That residual blood is not impure. That is pure. Even if you didn't wash it and you straight went to right, you just started your steak, right, it's pure. Right? Because all of the flowing blood has already been removed. Right? So since the flowing blood has been removed, the skin, right, the hide is pure, because the blood is removed from there as well. Right? So on the basis of that, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Kullu ihabin idha dubigha tahur faqad tahura." That all hide, when it is tanned, then it is pure. Right? So if we break it down, just to break it down mentally first, and then we'll show you that. Right, if an animal was not slaughtered, its hide is impure. If it is tanned, it becomes pure. If an animal was slaughtered, its hide is pure whether it's tanned or not. Right, so that's the breakdown. Now let's see what Imam al-Quduri alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala wa nafa'na bihi says. Right, so he says, وَكُلُّ إِهَابٍ دُبِغَ فَقَدْ طَهُرَ. All hide that is tanned, right, is pure. Because tanning is a process of removing that moisture from within the skin, right, that would be impure. So he says that all hide that is tanned is considered pure. وَجَازِتِ الصَّلَاةُ فِيهِ. It is permissible to pray in it, or wearing it, or on it. They say it's your prayer mat, right, or you're wearing a leather jacket, or right, you can pray in it. وَالْوُدُوءُ مِنْهُ. And you can make wudu from it. Right, because they used to use vessels, right, sometimes like a water skin, they would use that. One group of people, an animal died, one of their animals died, and they were disposing of it. It died of natural causes, so they couldn't eat it. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said to them, "Why don't you take benefit from it?" They said that it died, like it wasn't slaughtered. He said it doesn't mean that you can't benefit from its skin. Right? Right, so wudu from it, right, except for the skin or right, of pigs and humans. The skin of pigs and humans. Right? For pigs are considered najasul ayn. They are intrinsically impure, even when they're alive. Right? Other animals, like if a cow walked up to you and brushed by you, is your clothes impure? No. A cow skin, when they're alive, is pure. Right? We're only discussing about it after they die, because of that flowing blood that comes out. Right? But pig skin, even when they're alive, it is impure. Right? So nothing can make, right, pig skin or right, pure whatsoever. Right? That's why Imam al-Haddad, he talks about that doing a haram action with a good intention is like trying to wash a pig with soap. And no matter how much you try, it will never make it pure. Right? Right? So the pig is excluded, right? Even if it's tanned, it's always impure. Right? And the humans are excluded because it is not permissible to benefit from any part of a human being. Right? Because of the karama, the ennoblements of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for humanity. Right? As Allah says, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have honored the children of Adam. Right? And we're not going to get into some other issues about that. Right? But generally, any benefit like using human hair, right, is not permissible. Right? Using human, right, if it's human skin, I don't know how they would do that, but right, it's not allowed, but it's not because of its impurity. It's not allowed because it's not allowed. Okay, tamam. So any hide, right, excluding the humans and the pigs, any animal, right, that it's slaughtered properly in an Islamic way, meaning that 3 out of the 4 vessels are cut, right, the windpipe, the food pipe, and 1 of the 2 jugular veins are cut, then the hide is pure, right, even if it's not tanned. If an animal dies of other causes besides the actual the Sharia compliant slaughtering, right, then the hide would only be pure if it was tanned. Now there's a few different ways to tan. There's a chemical way to do it, and then there's the natural way. The natural way that they would use, they would put dirt and put it under the sun until it dried out. right? Both of them are permissible, right? And the other way is like use chemicals to remove that moisture, right? The purpose is to remove that moisture, and once it's removed, once it's tanned, it's pure. Tamam. Tamam. And the exceptions are obviously, right, pigs and humans, right? Pigs and humans. Right, so if someone wears a leather jacket or something, right, if it's not from pig, right, because the process of the leather, it's already tanned, right, then it's permissible. You can pray in it, you can wear it, you can have it on your couch, right, you can whatever. Right, but if it's from pig, then that's problematic. Right, so there are some companies that make wallets or different things out of pig skin. Okay, and that's just something to watch out for. Some of them, like most companies, they actually advertise that it's from a cow or it's from, right, they'll tell you directly. Some you have to dig a little bit, right, but I don't think majority of the companies use pig. I think majority are calf or cow, right, but something to keep an eye out for, right? Tamam. Now, if there's like incidental usage of like pig, like in the past they used to have this type of footwear that they would use pig hair to sew it because it was strong enough, it wouldn't break. Right? Something incidental like that would be overlooked. Right? Something like its incidental presence in a thing would not say that if you pray in those shoes then your prayer is valid. No. Right? But if the whole shoe is made, then that's a different story. So that's something to look out for if someone's wearing leather shoes. In some texts they describe like you can tell the leather of pig leather, right, by its porousness, and it kind of looks like a basketball. It's got like the bumps, right? But Allahu Alam, I'm sure that they can remove that if they wished. There's some process or something, right? But it's something to look into. Right, now, regarding other parts of the animals, right? So we mentioned that if the animal dies of other than Islamically approved slaughtering, right, then the entire animal is impure. The entire animal is impure, including their skin. Right. So, what about the other parts of the body, right? Besides the skin, what about like the organs, or what about the hoofs or the claws or whatever parts animals have? Right, so they mention, Imam Quduri, he says, وَشَعْرُ الْمَيْتَةِ وَعَظْمُهَا وَحَافِرُهَا وَعَصَبُهَا وَقَرْنُهَا طَاهِرٌ. That the hair, so there's a difference between the skin, the hide, and the hair itself. Right, so the hair of the Mayta is the animal that died of other causes than Sharia cause. Otherwise it would be called madhbuh, right, the slaughtered animal. Right, so the hair, the bones, the hoofs, what's the plural of hoof? Hooves, yeah. Its tendons, right, so it's kind of like the bones. And the qarn, the horns, are all pure. Right, they are all pure. That's the text on the right. Right, so the criteria of why these are pure and why everything else is not is that those parts, the flowing blood does not go into. Right, so there's a few types of definitions they give, all leading to pretty much the same principle. That anything la yahillu fihi al-haya, that life does not exist in it, right, is pure. Right? Like for instance, fingernails. Right? If you would use a human, right, fingernails. So they say one of the ways to tell is, does it hurt when you take it off? Does it hurt when you cut it? Does it hurt when you cut your fingernails? No. Right? Does it hurt when you it's your hair? No. Right? So similar thing. Right? Any part of an animal, right, that one, either it wouldn't hurt when it's removed, or that thing does not have flowing blood into it. Right? So like a hoof would probably hurt, right, if it was removed, but it doesn't have flowing blood within it, just like the arms and the face and the body, right, has. right? So, like duck feathers, or right, animal fur, or sheep skin, right, or sheep fur, or the wool that comes off of, right? All of those things are pure. They're all pure because they don't have that blood within them, and second, they're not pain causing when they're removed. Right? So one or the other. Same thing with like the likes of ivory and these things. Even though injustice to animals is injustice to animals, and to the extent that we can disassociate ourselves with that, right? We have to. We should. Right? And we should have mentioned when we were talking about leather that it's also very important to seek out ethical companies because of the torture of the animals. Right? We as Muslims should raise our standards and disassociate ourselves with any oppression, whether it be to humans or animals or other. Tamam. Right, so those are one of those two criteria apply, then the thing is pure. Right? That there is no pain when it's removed, or there is no flowing blood through that part. A friend of mine, he's a fireman, he said that one of the amazing signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the fingernail. He's like, you cut it and it just grows back, and you cut it and it grows back. It's like, is there a whole spool of fingernail in there that just, like, or like, you know, the tissue in the bathroom, you pull it and more comes? Like, subhanAllah. It was that, and there was one other thing. It was just as comical. He said, rain. He's like, why doesn't it just come down in one shot? That would be devastating. Right, but speaking of rain, the next issue he brings up is wells. Now wells, right, in some countries are not, right, as prevalent. In other countries they're very prevalent. Like in the city of Tarim, almost all of the water comes from well, right? Because if you're waiting on rain, don't hold your breath. Right? Out of over 3 years being there, it rained about 5 minutes total in 3.5 years. Right? It'll rain 1 minute, 2 minutes, stop. A year later, 1 minute, 2 minutes, stop. So all of the rain is coming from groundwater, right, from well water. So in some places it's very important to know the rulings of wells, but it's important to just have an encompassing understanding of the rulings, just in case one finds themselves in a situation. Now, we mentioned before that the Prophet commanded us to protect water. So generally people would care for wells by covering them. They would keep them covered. Right? Other places, the wells were just exposed, right, to the sky. So things would happen. Animals would come, birds would fly over, right? Droppings would fall in, right? Things would happen. Right? So the rulings are important. So the Prophet ﷺ, he taught about wells. So generally, we already took that any small amount of water that's not flowing, if impurity drops in it, what's the ruling of the water? If impurity drops in a small amount of water that's stagnant, what happens to the water? It's impure. Right? Now, the well is, again, small amount of water. It's not very, it could be very deep, but it's not very much surface area. So if one drop of impurity would cause the well to be impure, that would be very difficult on people, because many people, that's their source of drink, and that's their only source of wudu, right? For wudu, and for them to purify the well is not a very easy process, right? So much of the rulings of the well are based solely on prophetic narrations, only, not by intellectual. Not by logical reasoning, because reasoning would assume that wells will never be pure. You can say like a well, there's impurity in it. Okay, you tried to take out all the water, right? You take out one bucket, it fills up more. All of that's impure. You take another, it fills up more. It's all impure. Even if you could hypothetically get all the water out, the walls are still wet with impure water, and then the rest, it would never get pure. So logic entails, right? It would never be pure. So because of that, we leave logic aside. The hadith says this, and that's how we live. Right? Because we mentioned already, Allah says in the verse of purification that He does not intend to put any undue hardship on you. Rather, He intends to purify you. Right? So So the rulings of the well are pretty straightforward. That if any impurity falls into the well, right, to any amount of impurity falls into the well, the water is impure and you have to remove the water that's in it. There's an exception to like the droppings of birds and these things because they're constant and they're hard. So, but if those droppings are a lot, then this ruling applies. If it's a little bit, then it's excused. Right? But say a drop of blood falls into the well. A drop of blood is not normal for wells to have blood in it, right? It's not like a bird dropping. Right? So a drop of blood or a drop of alcohol or a drop of urine, right, falls into the well. The water is impure, right? And in order to purify the well, all of the water must be removed. Now, some wells, if you take out one bucket, one bucket of water fills it back up. And because the pressure from the ground, it continues to come out, but only to a certain level, and it keeps it at that level. Other wells, if you took out a bucket, it would slowly just decrease. They don't fill in as fast. Right, so if you're able to remove all of the water, you have to remove all of the water that's in the well, and then the well is pure, regardless of the wetness of the walls and everything. All that is overlooked. Right, if you cannot remove all the water, because right, every time you take out a bucket, more fills in, right, then you would only take out the equivalent amount that was in there. So, and you can. Right, there's a few ways to dictate this. Imam Muhammad, he said, just estimate 200 to 300 buckets and that's enough. That's enough for other ones. Just to make it easy on the people, instead of trying to figure out how much water is really in here, how much do I actually have to take out. He said just 200, 300 buckets. Right. The other opinion is that right, you find somebody who's knowledgeable about wells, you ask them how much water is in there. He said, okay, I think this much. Do you take out that much? Ma'asalama. That's it. Right. You don't have to think anything further than that. Tamam. So once the last bucket is removed, whether it be the actual last bucket because you took out all the water, or the last bucket according to your estimation, right, then the water is pure, the walls of the well are pure, the bucket is pure, the rope is pure, the hand of the person who was removing the water, if it got wet, that would still be pure as well. Everything is considered pure by doing that. As Imam Quduri says, وَكَانَ النَّزْحُ مَا فِيهَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ طَهَارَةً لَهَا. Removing the water that was in it is purification for it. Tamam. We mentioned already that like droppings of animals, right, are excused to the extent that they're not a lot, because it's really difficult to protect the wells from even a little bit of those droppings, right? But it's likely that one can protect the wells from a lot. Right? A lot is not excused, and they say the definition of a lot is that either what you deem to be a lot, so that's a lot. You look at it, oh, that's a lot. Right? And that's the opinion of the Imam. He doesn't estimate numbers, because numbers are only from the lawgiver. How could I say this many when Allah didn't say it, when the Prophet didn't say it? And that's very practical. He said that whatever do you think it's a lot? If yes, then don't use it. It's impure. Others gave a more practical definition, because some people are just confused. What do you mean by a lot? I mean, they don't have really an opinion. They say that every time you take out a bucket, there's droppings in it every single time. Then that's a lot, right? So that's excused because of hardship. But impurities that fall in other than that, right, are not normal to fall into that. It's not custom. It's not customarily, right, experienced. So they're not excused. The second issue they talk about, besides impurities falling in, is animals. Animals dying in the well. Right, one time, one of the shuyukh, they were walking past the well and they saw a bird that had a rat in its claws. and they dropped the rat right into the well. So he's thinking, subhanAllah, like, now that Quduri lesson benefits me. Many students don't like this chapter because they don't think it's practical. But it's very important. Almost every issue has practicality in some place in the world. And people will ask questions, and people may, you might, in your travels in the world, you might have to see some things. Okay, so regarding animals dying in the well. So this applies to either the animal fell in the well and then died, or a dead animal was put into the well, like we mentioned about the bird dropping the animal, the dead rat, into the well. Right, so now water would be removed from the well in order to purify it, right, according to the size of that animal. Right, because death, right, leads to impurity. As we mentioned already in tanning, the flowing blood in the body, if it's not removed by a slaughter, right, that body is impure. Right? And generally, death, right, so an animal dies, that animal is impure. Right? The well, therefore, impurities in a well, right, the well is impure. Right, so if it's a small-sized animal, then it's obligatory to take out 20 buckets, and recommended to increase it to 30. Recommended to increase it to 30, just for caution. Okay, so Imam al-Quduri, he says, فَإِنْ مَاتَتْ فِيهَا فَأْرَةٌ أَوْ أُسْفُورَةٌ أَوْ صَعْوَةٌ أَوْ سُودَانِيَّةٌ أَوْ سَامٌ أَبْرَص نُزِحَ مِنْهَا مَا بَيْنَ 20 دَلْوًا إِلَى 30 دَلْوًا. Right? He says if a rat or a sparrow, right, or these small types of animals, or a gecko, or small types of animals fall into the well, then 20 buckets up to 30 are taken out. The 20 is the obligatory, right? The 30 is a recommendation for extra caution. So then he says, وَإِنْ مَاتَتْ فِيهَا حَمَامَةٌ أَوْ دَجَاجَةٌ أَوْ سِنُّورٌ, right? If a pigeon or a chicken or a cat falls, a dead cat is found in the well, right? So that's a medium-sized animal, right? Then 40 buckets is obligatory, 60 is recommended, so double. وفي الدجاجة فأربعون وشبهها وإن تقع نجاسة في نبره receipt. So 40 is obligatory, 60 is recommended. If it's a large animal, he says, وَإِنْ مَاتَتْ فِيهَا كَلْبٌ أَوْ شَاةٌ أَوْ آدَمِيٌّ نُزِحَ جَمِيعُ مَائِهَا. If a dog or a goat or a human die in the well, then all of the water must be removed. All of the water must be removed, and we apply the same principle. Either you actually can remove all the water, then you have to do so. Right? If you cannot remove all the water, then to the equivalent amounts. The equivalent amounts. Right? For practicality, you could suffice with 200 to 300, according to Imam Muhammad. So this actually happened, right? At the time of the Sahaba, a man was found dead in Zamzam, in the well of Zamzam, right? And the Khalifa of the time ordered that all the water be removed. Right? All the water be removed. Right? And then it fills in later. It comes back. Now the same thing applies, regardless of the size of the animal. If the animal is found in the well, dead and bloated, right? So the body bloated is decomposing, right? Then all the water has to be removed. Even if it's as small as a rat or as large as a dog, all the water has to be removed if it's bloated. So if you just find a rat and the rat is still intact, it's not decomposing, right? Then you just take out the rat. I forgot to mention that. I guess that's kind of obvious. You remove the rat first, and then you remove 20 buckets to 30. Right? Don't leave the rat, right? And then remove 20 buckets, because then you have to remove the rat and 20 more, because there's no point to that. But if the animal is found having already bloated or starting to decompose, right, then all the water has to be removed, regardless of the size of the animal. Now there's an issue. What if you come to a well and you see an animal in it that is dead, but you don't know when it happened? Right? There's one thing that you saw it happen, right? And now you know that prior to that the water was pure, now it's impure, and you act accordingly. But what if you see it and you didn't even realize it? And this happened during the time of the students of Imam Abu Hanifa. Imam Abu Yusuf experienced this. Right? And he already prayed. He already made wudu from the water, and he already prayed. And so we'll talk about what he did. Right, so that's an issue that we were going to address next. But before that, when we're talking about 20 to 30 buckets, 40 to 60 buckets, or all of the well, or 200 buckets or so, right? What bucket are we talking about? The average size bucket. Now the average size bucket is, they define it to be the bucket that is generally used for that well. So a lot of wells, they'll have a bucket attached to it, or next to it, or nearby it, or everyone, or there's a customary size of bucket that you would use. So if you get to a well and there's no buckets, so you bring your own bucket, but your bucket is grand size. You bought it like Costco size bucket, giant, right? So your one bucket equals double the normal bucket. So then instead of 20, you would take out 10. You just accordingly, you would calculate. So if you can take out 20 buckets worth of water in 10, then that's sufficient. It's about the water, not the bucket. Right, so, or the opposite. If you have a tiny bucket, right, and each bucket you take out is like half of a normal bucket, then you would just double whatever you have to take out. Right, so, and this is all on the basis of reasonable judgment. Right? You don't have to take out measuring cups and say, okay, there, one. And then, no, you don't have to do that. Right? Generally, okay, big bucket, it's approximately double the size of a normal bucket. Okay, only 10 to 15, right, for a small animal. Right, so you would use your judgment. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be exact, because that would be undue hardship. And we already mentioned that Allah specifically mentions in the verse of purification that hardship is not something that Allah intended. So, now, back to the issue that we mentioned. If one doesn't know when the impurity happened, when the animal fell into the well, right, then we would judge it by what we see. We take out the animal. Is the animal bloated or not? If the animal is bloated, that's a sign that it was there for a while, right? Then one would, right? The ruling is that one would, if they use that water to make wudu, or to make ghusl, or to wash their clothing, right? Then any prayers that they prayed with that wudu, or with those clothes that they washed from that water, would have to be repeated for 3 days, 72 hours of prayers. Right? So it's as if we're estimating that animal has been there for 3 days. Right? But if you only use the well once, then you'd only have to pray, right, whatever prayer you prayed with that wudu. Right? But in the situation that you made all of your wudus from that well, you washed all of your clothes that had impurities on it from that well, right, then we would deem it from 3 days. Right? And there's no sin on the person, but they would just have to make it up. If it's not bloated, then just 24 hours of prayers. Right now, this is the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa. Right? However, his students, right, they took a secondary opinion that you don't have to repeat anything until you find out when the animal fell. Right? Now that's not the relied upon position, but that position can be taken for other things. So for instance, you were wearing clothes and all of a sudden you find out that there was impurity on those clothes, but you don't know from when. Right? How many prayers did you pray in those clothes, but you don't know when that impurity happened. Right? So the position of the students of Imam Abu Hanifa can be taken there. When you find it, then it is deemed impure from that time on, unless you are reasonably sure or certain that it happened at a certain time. And so if you have no clue, Right? You find blood on your shirt. You have no clue from where. Well, first, if it's not enough to affect the validity of the prayer, then you don't have to do anything. Right? You're not accountable for that. Right? If it was enough that it would, if it's more than a dirham size, we'll talk about that later. Right? 5 grams or 5 centimeters. Right? And that would affect the validity of the prayer. Right? But if you don't know when it happened, right, then you're not accountable until you either know, but you're accountable from that point on. Unless you remember, the light bulb goes off. Now I know. It was from Thursday evening, right before Isha. Then you'd have to, any prayers that you prayed in those clothes, you'd have to repeat. Right, so if the animal is found in the well, bloated, right, then everything is repeated from 72 hours, 3 days. If the animal is found in the well, not bloated, then 24 hours. Because if it's not bloated, that means it wasn't there for long. So only 24 hours. Tamam. Any questions on wells or tanning? Yeah, so, by water source, you mean wells?
Yes, because like this happened to us, and so I remember.
I think Shaykh Faraz mentioned it. We found dead animal in the.
I was the one who cleaned the tank. I had to clean the tank. So our water source, the bird fell in it, and I cleaned. So I remember the bird was loaded, and I could tell because it was actually moving from the number of maggots in it. So it was definitely the second category. So the 3 days of washing that we did before we realized it was impure, like not pure.
Yeah.
You have to sort of guess, because how can you remember what laundry you did in the past?
Yeah, just reasonable guess. Reasonable guess. Right, they even mentioned, like, if you have a garment and you know there's impurity, but you don't know is it on the left side or is it on the right side. Right? If you wash any one side, right, all of it's pure, even if you got the wrong side. Right? So it's a reasonable estimation is sufficient. Right? Same thing like what they would have in the past, they would have bales of hay, but then like the horse would urinate on it. And now they want to sell it. You can't sell impurities. Right? So they say if you divide it in 2, you don't know which one is the one that has it, you can sell both. There's a lot of issues like that. Like for instance, if you have an apple and there's a worm in it, right? Can you eat a worm? No, right? So can you eat the apple? Right? If you eat all of the apple at once, then no, you can't. Right? If you take one bite, right? Okay, no worm, because there's no certainty that any one bite has a worm. So you can eat piece by piece. You could eat the apple technically. Right? So estimated guess would be sufficient. The last issue that they usually cover regarding water is leftover water. Su'ur. Asar is the plural. Su'ur is the water that remains in the vessel after someone had already drinking from it. So it's called leftover water because there's imtizaj, there's a mixture of the saliva of that person or animal, right, and the water itself. Now the saliva of an animal, right, the water that they drink, it takes the same ruling as their saliva. Right, so human saliva is pure. Right, so the water that a human drinks, right, after they have drinking is still considered pure. Right, but depending on the type of animal, right, then the water will change. And the sweat of the animal has the same ruling. Right, so this human sweat is pure. Right, so they divide it into 4 categories, right? Leftover water is pure if it's the leftover water of a human or any animal that is halal to eat. So if a cow drinks, right, from a water vessel that you use to make wudu, right, the water is fine. The water is pure. Whether you would want to make, well, that's your decision, but it's not because of any rulings. Right? So say you're out traveling, you and your horse, right? You're out for a midday stroll through the pathways of your backyard, you live on the end of the forest, right? And you put down your thing to make wudu, and then you turn your back for a second and the horse is already drinking. Can you make wudu from that? Yes, right? Because horses, right, are pure. Their saliva is pure, right? So humans or any animal that is edible, meaning halal to eat. Now, the water is considered impure if the one who drank from it is a dog, a pig, or a predatory animal. A predatory animal. An animal that eats other animals. Right, so dog saliva is impure. Dog saliva is impure. Right? But a dry dog, right, is not impure. Right? The only thing that's impure is their saliva, right, and which would include the wetness of their nose. Right? But if their nose touches you, right, then if the wetness is clearly manifest on your clothes, then it's impure. But if it's, right, you can just feel a little bit, but you can't see it, then you just ignore it. Right? Right? But the saliva is impure.
You said the sweat.
No, not the sweat. The saliva, the wetness of their nose is considered like saliva. Okay, so if a dog drank out of a vessel, you cannot eat out of that. You cannot drink nor make wudu out of that vessel. All right, same thing for the pig, and same thing for the predatory animal. Right, so if you have a pet tiger, right, then you can't make wudu from its water bowl. Okay, it's disliked, right? Meaning it's disliked if there is an other option. So you have two vessels. One is completely pure, and the other one was the leftover water of a cat. Right? It would be disliked to choose the one that was drinking from by the cat. Right? But it's still pure, and it's still purifying. Right? The wudu is valid, but it's disliked to do so. Right? So that would apply to the leftover water of a cat. A roaming chicken, meaning a chicken who is allowed to freely roam around and eat. Right? Because generally, sometimes they eat from impure things. Okay, this also applies to predatory birds. Predatory birds like falcons and vultures and things like that. Rodents, right? And rodents here, right, applies to all sawakinul buyut, right? The inhabitants of the homes. I mean, those critters that come in the home and you can't really stop it. Right, so they're leftover water, so that would apply to anything that really could drink water, like rats, mice, cockroaches, what else? Whatever, scorpions, right? Geckos. You know, there's those little lizards in some countries. In Bangladesh, they call them tik-tik. Right? And tik-tik means, in Bangladesh, means yes, yes. So it's like you're having a conversation and all you hear is tik-tik. Right? He's agreeing with me. Right? So they're all over the place. You can't get rid of them. Right? And generally, tropical areas have open windows and they just come in. So if they drink from the water, right, then it's disliked to choose that water if you have another choice. If you don't have any choice but that, then it's not disliked at all. Next question.
What about things like raccoons, squirrels, skunks?
Yeah, those are generally would be stopped from coming in, so they wouldn't. Right? The purpose is because they're tawafina alaykum wa tawafat. Right? The Prophet mentioned about these types of animals, right? And that he, right, generally the ruling would be one thing, right? But because of difficulty, right, the ruling is lightened. Right? And he compared it to the verse in the Quran, "Tawafuna alaykum ba'dukum ala ba'd." That people come and go, right? They're excused from having to ask for permission constantly. So if you have, like for instance, you hire a cleaner, every time she comes, does she have to knock on the door? Like say you're in the office, she wants to clean the office, now she has to knock on that door. Then you move to the bedroom, she has to clean the bedroom, you want to knock on that door. Right? So he made the cat similar to that. They come and go. So it will be difficulty. So if you have a pet cat specifically, it would be difficult to stop them from drinking. Now we use the tap, but before they would use vessels. Right, so that would be disliked if there is another choice. If there's no other choice, then it's not disliked. Now the last one is interesting. The leftover water of donkeys or mules is considered mashkuk, doubtful. It's considered doubtful. Now, it's doubtful on whether it's purifying, right? Not whether it's pure. Right? So it's not impure, right? But can you use it for wudu or ghusl? Right? There is two opposing texts generally. Right? One text would indicate that it's completely permissible to use it for wudu, and one text would indicate otherwise. So in that case, it would be doubtful. Right? So if one is pressed with the choice of making wudu with donkey water, leftover donkey water, Jazakallah khairan. Barakallah fikum. Who can recall the ruling of making wudu with coffee? You can?
Can't because it's not called water anymore. It's called
Good. Right? You can't because it's no longer called water. Right? Even though it's a pure substance added into water, right? As long as it's still thin and flowing, right? It wouldn't change the water from. The water would still be usable, but with the condition that the water is still called water. Right? So this would not be called water; it would be called coffee. So you can't do it. But if it was like somebody had water and they dropped a date seed in it, pure substance, as long as the water is still thin and fluid, right, you can use it. So that's aside the point. Back to the donkeys and mules. If a donkey drinks from water, or a mule drinks from water, right, that water is doubtful on whether you can use it for purification. It's not impure if it gets on you, right? But can you use it for wudu? Right? There's a difference of opinion, so it's doubtful because of the different texts that are related to it. Right? So in that case, if the only thing you have is leftover donkey water in this really far-fetched situation, right, then they say that you should make wudu and tayammum. That's the only water you have. You should make wudu and tayammum, right? So that you have purification either by the water, right, in the case that it actually is pure with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the purifying, right, or with the tayammum, right, in the case that it wasn't, therefore you had no water and the tayammum is valid. Not with both, right? It's one or the other, because we don't combine between washing and tayammum. There's no such thing. So we're not going for both, we're going for one or the other. Like for instance, if a person cannot make wudu and tayammum at the same time, right? A person can't wipe and wash on their socks, right? So if I have a leather sock on one foot and no sock on the other foot, I can't wash one, wipe the other. We can't combine between the two, because an alternative is just that, right? This is not there, therefore this. You can't have an alternative if the original is there. Okay. So in the far-fetched situation that one only has donkey water or mule water, then make tayammum and wudu. Make tayammum and wudu. And it doesn't matter what order you wish to do it in, but some said the tayammum is better first, and then the water will wash it off. But if your face is wet and then you put, you're gonna remain dirty, literally. But it doesn't matter the order. All right, tamam. Now the biggest part of today's class is tayammum. Not biggest in size, but importance. Because tayammum is an alternative to the wudu and the ghusl. So in the case that a person, right, does not have water. Now Allah mentions in the same verse, the verse of purification, but if you are ill, right, so sickness, or on a journey, meaning you're far away from water, right, or you have relieved yourselves, or have been intimate with your spouses, and cannot find water. So those three things, and you cannot find water, then purify yourselves with clean earth by wiping your faces and hands. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, جُعِلَتْ لِي الْأَرْضُ مَسْجِدًا وَطَهُورًا. The earth was made for me as a as a means of purification. It was made for me purifying and a place of prayer. And he continued to say that anybody who is who salat comes, then they should pray wherever they are. Meaning if they're traveling, they don't have to find a masjid. They can pray anywhere. And so from this verse you can take that there's certain excuses that allow a person to make tayammum instead of making wudu or ghusl. If these excuses are found, then the tayammum is a valid alternative to the two, whether you're in a state of major impurity or minor. It applies to both. So the first is the biggest one, right? فَإِن لَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً, if you cannot find water, so the absence of water. And that would apply to the absence of a sufficient amount of water to make wudu. So for instance, you're traveling and you find water, but it's only enough to wash your face. Do you have to wash your face and then make tayammum? No, because we don't combine between the two. Even if it's enough to wash your face, your arms, and wipe your head, but not enough to wash your feet, then you don't have to use it. It's as if you don't have anything. But if a person had just enough water to wash their face once, their arms once, they wipe 1/4 of their head and wash their feet once, they have to use the water. They have to use the water. Even if you have to leave all the sunnah, you have to use the water, because the alternative is only an alternative when the original is not possible. So absence of water, that applies directly to not having any water, or having an insufficient amount of water, or the water is too far away, it would be unduly difficult to get to it. So all of those situations are valid. Do you recall a sense of the modern calculation of a mil in the sense of felicity in the English? And we'll be finishing off the chapter of Tayammum next week, or just an introduction to it. We'll recover this again as well. The second criteria, besides absence of water, is the inability to use the water. So the water is there, but you can't use it. So if you can't use it for any of the following reasons, then it's as if it's not there. So the water is there, perfectly ready, sufficient amount, and it's pure, but you are sick. And you have reasonable surety that either if you use the water, you will get sick, or you're already sick, and if you use the water, you'll get worse, or you're already sick, and if you use the water, it will slow down your recovery time. So any of those three apply to sickness, or fear of sickness. So for instance, if any of you have been in a situation where the water is extremely cold, I've had to go through this many times. I wish I knew the ruling then, because I would not have made wudu with freezing cold water. I'm not very good with the cold. So a person, if they're reasonably sure that this is going to cause them undue hardship, not just the inconvenience of cold water. Nobody likes to make wudu with but discomfort is not what's excused. A fear of actual sickness, or the increase of a sickness, excuses one from using that water. So it's as if the water is not there, because we're not allowed to cause ourselves that harm. And this happened to the Sahaba. One of the companions, he was leading the army, and he had at night he ended up in a state of major impurity while he was sleeping. He woke up, and instead of making the ghusl, he actually rolled around in the dirt, and he led the salah. And they complained to the Prophet that this guy is leading our prayer like this, and the Prophet condoned what he did, but taught him how to do a proper tayammum. The method he used was wrong, but he was right to not have made the ghusl, because he said that I feared that I would be sick and then no one would lead the army. The second is a fear of an enemy. Like if you go out to the water, so-and-so tribe is looking for you, you're going to get captured. But that also applies to like a predatory animal. So in some places they use wells. If you go outside, there's like coyotes and like lions and these things. If you were to go out there, it's possible that you could. Right? If there's reasonable fear, then you don't have to go out. The same thing applies to oppressors. If someone's looking for you, right? And if you go out, they'll find you. Then you don't have to go out. The other is that you have the water, but you need it for something more important. Right? Because preservation of life is more important than making the wudu instead of the tayammum. Because there's an alternative. There's a tayammum. There's no alternative to life. Right? So you're traveling a long distance through the desert. You have a certain amount of water, but you need that water in order to drink, in order to make it to your destination. Right? So instead of using up your last drinking water to make wudu, you don't have to. You can make tayammum and keep the water for drinking. Right? And that applies to the water that you need to cook essential food. Right? So if you have food that you can't eat unless you use it, unless you mix it with water and cook it, right, on that journey, then you can keep the water. You don't need to. And that applies for you to drink and the people with you. If they're drinking from the same water, right? If you make wudu, they can't drink, then you can make tayammum instead. Right? And the last one is very unique, right? Because it doesn't entail any of the previous conditions. If you fear missing a prayer that has no substitute, if you were to go and make wudu, that by the time you went to make wudu and you would come back, the prayer would be finished. You're allowed to make tayammum. But that's only for those prayers which has no substitute. That if you missed it, that's it. Game over. Right? And generally that applies to two types of prayer, two prayers. The Eid prayer, right? Both Eid prayers, and the Janazah prayer. Because once the Janazah prayer is performed, it's not repeated. Right? And for the Eid prayer, right, same thing. If you miss it, see you next year. There's no qada of their Eid prayer. Right? So, and this happened to me. I had a teacher. Right? I told him I was going for Umrah, and he said, I give you one advice. Don't miss any Janazah prayer. Because every day in the Haram, there's a Janazah prayer. Right? Constantly, sometimes multiple times per day. He said, because every time you pray Janazah prayer, you have the reward of Uhud. He's quoting a hadith. So they called the as-salat al-jami'a rahimakumullah. They announced the Janazah prayer. And I knew if I were to go all the way downstairs, in Medina, you have to go to the basement to get to the wudu area, I would never have made it back. So I was walking through the dirt, so I had turned my shoes upside down, made tayammum, and then prayed the prayer with them. Right? Because if I were to miss that, I would not have that opportunity again. Right? So in only the prayers that don't have a substitute. So what about dhuhr? Does dhuhr have a substitute? What's the substitute? Good, the make-up prayer. You can make it up. Right, so if you wake up, all right, say you have 35 seconds till Fajr is over. Right, can you make tayammum and then pray? No. Right? Some scholars, they said that you should still do it, just out of respect for the time, and then repeat the prayer anyway. Right? Well, not repeat it, but do the prayer later. Right? But it's not valid. It's not valid like that. Because it has an alternative, which is qada, make-up. How about Jumu'ah? Jumu'ah is once a week. The substitute is dhuhr. If you fear you're going to miss Jumu'ah, if you go and make wudu, you have to go and make wudu, right? Because you could just pray dhuhr. That's an alternative. Now this applies to before the prayer or during the prayer. So you started the prayer with wudu, but you broke your wudu in the middle of the janazah prayer. Now you know that if you go and make wudu and come back, you would miss the whole prayer. Right? You can just quickly make tayammum, right? And then continue. Now, a lot of the old masjids, they would have pillars made out of something that would be valid to use for tayammum. So you could just literally just right next to you and then continue. Right? But now it's probably harder to find. We'll talk about next week what you can use to make tayammum, right? In more detail. Inshallah. So we'll stop there. Give Shaykh Faraz his time. Any last questions before we close?
Sheikh Yusuf, for the Eid prayers, I've seen some masjid, they have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I've seen 4. That doesn't count?
Yeah, it counts.
So they can do that, right?
Yeah, it
It's
counts.
7 o'clock prayer, 8
It's
o'clock.
it's the same rulings as Jumu'ah. So Eid and Jumu'ah are pretty much exactly the same in their rulings, except the method of prayer of Eid is slightly different, and khutbah is not a condition of the Eid.
No, but Tayammum you said, because they don't have.
Oh.
So if someone can't catch the 7 o'clock,
Oh.
does it Tayammum or wait for 8 o'clock?
That's a great question, actually. That's a really good question. MashaAllah. I'll confirm it with Shaykh Faraz,
Okay, sure.
but most likely it would be better to wait if they can. Like, but if they have work and they're not going to be able to do it, then that might have some consideration. But I'll ask him right now. So I like to ask him cool questions.
For the Tayammum for missing a prayer, is this only for people, for prayers that are obligatory or wajib for a person? So, for example, Eid for women, for example, would they be able to pray Tayammum, or would they just go back?
But no, the Prophet commanded for women as well. Right? He encouraged them to pray their Eid prayer as well. So in order to fulfill that encouragement, or that command, they'd have to do what they have to do. Make tayammum?
Wajib.
Not necessarily.
What about the daytime eclipse prayer?
Yeah, those also apply as well. Like the eclipse prayer, those are one-time things. So the usual common ones are janazah and Eid, but that would also apply. That would also apply. Yeah, of course, because there's no alternative. So next week we'll talk about the method of making tayammum, right? What you can make tayammum on, and then what breaks the tayammum. Right? Generally, it's the same as wudu, right? But depending on the excuse that caused you to use the tayammum, right? That adds to extra things that can break. Right? So we'll take that next week, inshallah. Any last question?
Yeah. So we've been talking about pure water and water that's purifying. Does it being drinkable have to do with whether or not it's purifying? Like, for example, the water in the well, in that situation, you can't really drink it, but it's purifying to.
Yeah, so it's not a condition that it's healthy for you. For some reason, I always drink the water in places you shouldn't drink the water. I got sick in Bangladesh, I got sick in Tarim, I got sick in Mexico. Right? Some reason I try not to drink it, and it just happens. Mexico, I made rice, but I used the tap water. I thought it would boil it out, but in Bangladesh, I had a bottle of water, but the locals drank it and then refilled it with the tap water, and I didn't know. Right? And then somehow in Tarim, I drank the water. All places I got sick, but the water is purifying. Right? The water counts for wudu. Generally, places like that would have water for wudu and then water for drinking separate. Right? In Tarim, they have trucks that come by to the houses and fill up your drinking water, whereas you would use the other water for your wudu and everything else. So we'll pause there, inshallah. Next week, we'll take Tayammum part 2, inshallah. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala sayyidina Muhammad wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.